Welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, and today we're exploring a fascinating topic that affects us all, how the way we live has changed. My guest today, Lucinda Hartley, who has been named one of Australia's 100 most influential women, is a serial founder, technology leader, a leading expert in social trends shaping the future of our cities and work, a TEDx speaker, and Chief Growth Officer at Mondas Capital. Now, Lucinda's written extensively about the disconnect between our evolving lifestyles and our static built environments. So I'd like to discuss how our homes and communities can better adapt to how we live, integrating technology, sustainability, and a sense of community into the very fabric of our buildings. So whether you're a property investor, a homeowner, or just curious about the future of our living, this episode's sure to provide you some valuable perspectives.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney Podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
The way we live, work and connect and move around has radically changed in recent decades. But what about our houses? What about our buildings? They haven't really changed much, have they? Now, I've been involved in property for over 5 decades, and as far as I can see, neighbourhood planning has relied on the assumption of specific lifestyle trajectories. This trajectory involves children growing up, partnering up, buying a property, settling down, becoming part of the neighbourhood. Communities have developed around the belief that most people are going to settle in one location and integrate in it. But according to my guest today, Lucinda Hartley, who's a leading expert in social trends shaping the future of our cities, this assumption has been upended. So I'm keen to get her thoughts of what's ahead and how we're going to live. Welcome, Lucinda.
Michael, thanks so much for having me.
Now, I've been following your articles on Substack, and I'm going to actually leave a link to those because I think anyone who's interested in property, in business and entrepreneurship should be getting your great content. As we both believe demographics is going to drive our destinies. But in one of your great articles, you pointed out how the way we live has changed, but buildings haven't. How have things evolved? What's changed recently? Is it because of COVID or are there other factors involved?
There's a lot of factors involved, and I think what we've seen from the COVID-19 lockdowns was an acceleration of the trend that was already happening. But if I think about the way that I grew up on my BMX bike in the 90s and with an old Mac Plus in the corner at home, it wasn't possible to work remotely. We still had a landline. We'd still go to the neighbours if we needed something after hours because the supermarkets weren't open. And if you fast forward to today and think about how we live, we're recording this remotely today. I mostly work from home. My kids have a mobile phone. These kinds of technological advancements have radically shaped the way that we live and work, and we can certainly dive into that a little bit more today. But I think the contrast of the way that we build houses hasn't changed that much. You know, you might consider putting a desk in your spare room or maybe converting your garage into some kind of workspace. But other than that, we haven't really considered that our home spaces are now often workspaces and that we often need to move about in different kind of patterns than we did before because we're not always going in and out of the city to the office.
No. Well, again, different generations are doing things differently. I'm a baby boomer, and I guess over the next decade, most baby boomers are going to leave the workforce. The Gen Xers are now behind us, and they're in many ways running the country and in politics and big companies. But the millennials and the Gen Xers, they're redefining things. I mean, Gen Xers, almost all of them, I read in one of your blogs, 98% own a smartphone. But that wasn't just in Australia, that's around the world. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, it is actually. That's what's really interesting, particularly, and if you look at the Generation Z, it's sort of the under 25s, it's a generation that's grown up completely digital, and that's not only in Australia, I grew up in East Africa, and you would be pressed to find anyone who didn't have a smartphone there. It's an almost completely cashless society. So we're seeing this leapfrogging effect where we've got a younger generation that's completely digital. And when you've grown up that way, it really challenges the way that we think and work and the assumptions that we make about what that even is. So the idea of having a fixed address, a fixed office address, a fixed sort of phone location are things that very much don't exist anymore. And it does really reshapes the way that we need to be thinking about office design, about home design, about even what the future of retail looks like.
Well, I guess talking about retail then, the phone is the new wallet, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't remember the last time I pulled out my wallet. In fact, Pam doesn't even use her phone. My wife uses her Apple Watch to pay for everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the future of digital payments is definitely online. And so you don't want, on the first hand, you don't need a wallet anymore. So that's one thing. You can just tap and go wherever you are. But I think what that means from a city context is the idea of having bricks and mortar stores is being redefined. So we still want experiences. So we still want to be able to go to a cafe and have that experience of meeting with family and friends or sitting outside in a different location. But we don't actually need to go there in terms to access the daily needs. So you don't have to go to a clothing store to access clothing. You don't have to go to a cafe to access the food. But there are some reasons why you might still want to do that. And it's often experience driven. And so particularly in the retail market, we're seeing, more and more new brands coming online that are completely digital first, that don't even have stores, and they're just direct to consumer. So it's creating this whole new market category in that way. Now, that really redefines how we think about what is the traditional neighborhood center, which would be, your shops, perhaps your supermarket, your cafe, these places that you might go. You don't have to have those anymore just to meet your daily needs. But there are other reasons that we might want to go there, like, for example, for social connection. And so if we're really smart, we can think about how to reposition these spaces to meet, new and emerging consumer demand. But if we're not really intentional about it, it's really quick that we could be left behind right now because generational shifts and technology advancements are happening very quickly.
Well, I actually see two conflicting things from what you just mentioned to me. On the one hand, we can be digital nomads, we can work anywhere. But on the other hand, working from home has created more hyper-local living. Both you and I are based in Melbourne, and it wasn't that many years ago that we were locked down, and neighbourhood became so important. The importance of a 20-minute neighbourhood, being able to walk, drive, travel, ride to a whole lot of things, not just one supermarket, but multiple ones, to shops, to sporting activities, to houses of worship. We still do want to connect, don't we?
Yeah, we're still social creatures at heart. And I think one of the reasons why lockdowns were so disruptive from a social perspective was because it made it harder to have those incidental social connections, or what social researchers would refer to as weak ties. So in terms of the bonds that we need in our life, we need strong bonds, like the sort that you'd have with strong ties, the sort that you'd have with family and friends. And we also need weak ties, which is the kind that you would have with colleagues or someone that you might see at a cafe or making eye contact with a stranger on the train. And one of the reasons that lockdowns were isolating wasn't that because we lost the strong ties, because actually we didn't really. We mostly still connected with family and friends online. It's because we eliminated, at least temporarily, the weak ties and those opportunities for incidental social connection. So it does sound conflicting in that we don't have to have things like shopping centres and cafes anymore in order to meet that need to eat and to shop. But in many cases, we will still seek out social connection because it's really important for us as social creatures. Often we need to force it a little bit more. If you're working from home and you're having your groceries delivered, and you don't actually have to leave the house for very much. So it requires like much more of a pull, like to leave the house and to engage with those activities.
Yes, sure. So what's going to happen to the shape of our cities, the look of our cities? How is it going to be if we came back in 20, 30 years' time? What would our big capital cities look like?
Well, there's what I hope they'll look like, and then perhaps the reality of what they might
true,
actually
yes.
look like. But I think if we were forecasting what cities would look like in the future based on social trends, we'd see a couple of things. One is that our traditional cities have been radial, right? All of our public transport has been based on coming in and out of the CBD, and it's actually much harder to get around. And that's the case for most cities. It's particularly prominent in places like Melbourne. So if at least half the population is working from home, which is what the census tells us, the need and the strong demand to only go in and out of the city should be calibrated by ability to go, in a radial direction or east-west or other directions and not just in and out anymore. So what that might mean is rather than having just one big strong anchor in the middle, we might have more of what you might call a polycentric city where we have smaller neighborhood activity centers, and it's likely that people will be spending more time adjacent to where they live rather than coming in and out of the city. So that's one thing that we'll see. The second is that we can assume quite large population growth. So, Australia's population at 2050 is predicted somewhere in the order of 35, 40 million people. Victoria's population somewhere in the order of 10 million, and it's currently at 6. So it's almost twice the number of Victorians, almost twice the number of people in New South Wales. So our cities will expand out to some extent, but they're mostly going to go up from here. There's only a limited finite growth that you can go out. It's very expensive to go out from a transport and service perspective. It's much more efficient to go up. So we are going to see a lot more high density growth, apartments, townhouses, particularly around public transport hubs where we can. That's the kind of general expression that we should see in the city. And if we still want those to be great places to live with great culture and lifestyle, then we also need to pay attention to the other things that go in between, like public open spaces, like cultural facilities. If you're going to double the population, you can't just have the same number of parks. You need to increase the open space as well. So we get a lot of conflicts and challenges in there. But I think, if we're smart, it's possible to do it.
Well, I think there's also going to be a change in how we live. People are getting married later in life. People aren't prepared to put their roots down. So older generations like me often think, I've learned not to anymore, think that they can't remain having fun all their lives. We had to settle down much sooner. But people are not as keen to settle down. They're remaining tenants longer. They're getting married later in life. How's that going to change the requirement for accommodation?
Yeah, well, if we look at the fastest growing category of population in Australia, it's single households, like single person households. And that's been the last sort of 5 years or so and continuing to increase. So we need a whole range of different accommodation outcomes, including single person households. We're also just seeing a general pattern that people don't live and work and stay in the same city, in the same neighborhood their whole life. Now, traditionally people did for all kinds of reasons. Travel was more expensive, work was less global. Now it's just as likely that you will live in as many cities as you might have suburbs previously. And so people are much more mobile. And it means we need an opportunity for much more flexible housing that can flex up and down. And we've seen certain models of this. I mean, you can look at the things like the co-living setup that they have in New York City, where you, instead of owning an apartment, you own a share in an apartment building, and that share in the apartment building gives you the right to rent an apartment. But you might at one stage in your life need a 1-bedroom. At another stage in your life, you might need a 3-bedroom. Then you might need to go down to a 2-bedroom. And so, it gives you the flexibility to move through different life stages within the same ownership structure. And I'm optimistic that we will see alternative ownership structures as well come into the Australian market that give us more flexibility in the way that we live than just the single family, single mortgage setup that we've had to date.
Well, that'll be interesting. It's really going to be very dependent upon finance, isn't it? And the banks understanding these new ways of living. You've also written a lot about the size of apartments, how much space we need. I mean, we're building the biggest dwellings in the world in many ways, aren't we? We were lucky enough to have lots of land, but now I think more people are trading backyards for balconies and courtyards. We are going to have more high density and medium density living. How much space do we need?
This is the ever-lasting question of how much space do we really need? And it's true that Australia has some of the largest, if not the largest in some cities, property footprints in the world by house size, second only to the US in most instances. And yes, we are in a housing affordability crisis. There's no denying that. And even smaller properties are still, expensive for many families. At the same time, we are often building very, very large houses. And in some places like, Paris or Tokyo, it's sufficient to have really, really small apartments. I've got the statistics in the article on my website, but would be considered like smaller than a studio here. Now, is that enough? I don't know if 25 square meters, 20 square meters, even 15 in some instances, I think is permitted in Paris, is sufficient size. But what I would think that we want to ask ourselves the question of is the flexibility of being able to move between different sizes and housing types and the trade-offs that we make. So often it's a trade-off between space and location where, potentially 30, 40 years ago, even 20 years ago, it might have been possible to have a larger home that was also close to a railway station and the schools that you wanted to go to and other things. These days, it may be more of a trade-off that you can either live in a smaller property that's close to those amenities or a larger property that's much further away. And I think when we are making those trade-offs, it's important to consider the lifestyle that we want to live and the kinds of impacts that might have on their lifestyle. And on a personal front, and I think I'm the anomaly from the population here, I value being able to walk to local amenities very highly. So I would choose to live in a smaller place that's closer to those rather than having the backyard and other things.
Well, I guess it really depends upon what stage of your life you're at. So as many millennials are now moving into family formation stage of their life, they're going to require another bedroom. And if they are going to move, they're probably going to want to put that Zoom room or media room in as well. So they are moving out from their apartments closer to the CBD and closer to the amenities. But you've also written a fascinating article about the fact that your neighbourhood can determine your life expectancy. What were you on about with that?
So some really interesting research that was done in the US by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, a 10-year longitudinal study, which has been replicated in Australia, actually. And what they were able to correlate was that your suburb was as likely to predict your life expectancy as your genetics. So where you live has a direct correlation to your life expectancy. And we can look at this in places like Melbourne and Sydney. In Sydney, if you live like in the inner eastern northern suburbs, you will have up to 10 years longer life expectancy than if you live in the outer west. Now, there's obviously many factors involved there, but the main reason that this study pointed to was there's three sort of broad categories of things that are likely to affect you about your suburb. One is whether you have good access to fresh food, so whether you're able to access all that kind of local amenities, supermarket, shops locally in your neighbourhood. Another is whether you have social connection, and I think sometimes more established suburbs have more established relationships. Newer suburbs take a little bit longer in some instances to develop the network of friends and social relationships that you would have in that area. And another is how much you can walk. So things like access to, and public transport also helps us walk more. When you have really good access to being able to be outside and walk around, you're likely to be more healthy than if you have to drive because there's really no other choice. And so the shape of our neighborhoods and the planning and design actually has these, big correlation with other comorbidities in our life, like heart disease and loneliness. And I think that's a critical factor for us to think about when we're shaping. We've got to double the size of our cities. So how do we take into account some of these factors so that we're actually building healthy, sustainable places to live?
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned loneliness. It seems to be that there's an epidemic of that. At two extremes, we're living longer and women usually outlive their husbands and they're on their own. Many in still the big houses, they're not prepared to move out or right-size, downsize until they downsize into that very little box, which I guess is a way of leaving your home. But there's also a lot of younger people. Is it this society where you haven't got real connections but virtual connections? Is that creating more loneliness too?
Yeah, statistically it is. And certainly, in some locations, up to 50% of people, like 1 in 2, have experienced more loneliness since the COVID lockdowns. Yeah, loneliness is a really massive factor for our society, and our cities have a lot to do with it. So we can design environments around us that force collaboration and connection with people, and it can come down to simple things like, what does the shape of the hallway look like? Or when we're in a neighborhood, can we make eye contact with our neighbors when we go out the front? Or do we just get into a lift, into our apartment, and we don't ever see another person? So we have a responsibility in the shape of our environments to think about how they can shape those opportunities for social connection. And it's particularly important now that more and more of us are working remotely, and the latest data from Swinburne University shows that that's only increasing. Actually, the number of people who are working fully remote or hybrid has increased in the last 2 years, not decreased. And that is a factor for loneliness as well. And it's a big challenge. There is a big difference between the way that we connect online than we do in real life. I think we can all relate to that. And that's where our neighborhoods really become such an important factor in whether or not we don't necessarily have to be best friends with our neighbors, but we have opportunities to make eye contact with other people that we might bump into them in the hallway.
So clearly how we're living is very different to the way our parents and our grandparents lived. Are urban planners up to speed with this? Because it seems that they've got so many balls in the air at the moment trying to work out where we're going to have higher density, how we're even going to build more affordable housing. We're not building enough social housing. What's happening?
Well, I'd say at an academic level, urban planners are definitely up to date with this and are big advocates for more socially inclusive, connected kind of environments and design. But I think when it comes to actually changing the landscape of the way that we design, build and execute on city planning and housing, it really takes such a long time to shift the dial. And at the moment, there is a huge push in from the federal and state governments in most states on housing, because we have a massive housing shortage. And that's a commendable approach. And I think that is absolutely the focus that we need to have. We don't have enough houses. But there is a risk that if we build houses without considering all of the other ancillary amenities, that we actually create secondary problems which will emerge in 5 to 10 years around, environments that will make you sick and sad or poorly built construction, where you don't have adequate noise protection or you don't have adequate opportunities for social connection. These are things that have to be factored. Our planning scheme doesn't mandate this. It comes down to having good design.
Now, are there places in the world we can take lessons from, other countries that are doing it well?
Yeah, you can always hold up some of the Scandinavian countries as having really good examples of this kind of design, some of which is regulated, some of which is not. One of my favourite examples is actually in Vancouver in Canada, from some of the co-housing developments where they've taken a regular apartment block, and instead of having, you can imagine an apartment corridor, it's fairly isolated and cold often, they turned that into an indoor street. So every house had almost like its own front yard, but inside with small areas to sit and different kinds of fences. And it meant that every time you go out from your apartment into the lift, you're actually walking down this small laneway street with opportunities to interact with lots of your neighbours. So that's a great example of a project that I think does it well. And I think on the whole, if you look at some of the new developments, and I'm always quite inspired by the new developments because that shows us what we can create from scratch that's happened in places, such as Rotterdam's, such as Copenhagen, where there are new sort of satellite towns, which from day one have some of the elements that we would hope to see in new developments, like public transport, like amenities, like good public spaces.
Now, sustainable living seems to be much more in the news nowadays, and a lot of people are critical of the way we're building our cities. Are we redesigning our buildings to be more environmentally sustainable, or is it just too expensive to do that at the moment?
This is always the challenge of cost versus efficiency and looking at the overall cost and life cycle of buildings rather than the initial upfront cost. So it depends on how you consider cost. And hopefully we're increasingly moving to a market where we're considering the lifespan of the building cost, not just the upfront sale cost when we're building it. I think regulation has a lot to play when it comes to environmental efficiency. I think it's, mandated to have at least a 5-star neighbours rating. I think it is, but could be more than that in some new build areas. Green Star is required in most new office buildings as well. So these kinds of rating systems do help elevate the level of quality, but also create a level playing field from an economic perspective if everyone needs to play by the same standards. There is a greater upfront cost. And so I'm interested in models, like build to rent, like others, that consider that we can space out that upfront cost investment over the life cycle of the building where possible.
So what role do government policies and regulations have in all this? I mean, in my mind, many of the politicians are working on 3 or 4 year cycles and not really thinking about spending a lot of money on infrastructure or planning for 10, 20 years down the track, which is really what I don't know, in my mind, they should be doing.
Yeah, and this has probably been the challenge over the past 20 years is that we have massively underinvested in housing and we have underinvested in infrastructure and we have a huge backlog. And so now it's even more difficult to catch up on the level of infrastructure and housing policy that's required.
Where are we going to put all the new schools, Lucinda? Everyone talks about hospital and aged care, and we know that we've got an ageing population, but we're still growing our population naturally and bringing people in at family formation age. So how are we going to find room for the schools? Or are they going to be vertical schools, different to what we used to have before?
I think we will see more vertical schools. Schools are such an important piece of social infrastructure. They're not just about the school. They're often such an anchor and a community hub for so many people. We've seen great examples of vertical schools in places like Port Melbourne in Fisherman's Bend, where there's the new vertical school in Montague. We've seen even, private institutions like Haileybury build a vertical school in the CBD. So I think we are likely to see more of that. I think it is a mindset shift. We're not going to be able to have double the population with as many schools as we will need to expand to accommodate that and have all of them with multiple ovals and the open space that, we might have grown up with. So it is a mindset shift, but I think we can still provide for adequate, activity space, open space in a vertical schools model.
Well, I think we've covered a lot in our discussion today, and I'm not sure we've come up with any answers, but we've asked the right questions. You've brought us a different way of thinking. So hopefully our listeners, our politicians will actually have a think about how to make Australia better. And I still believe that we're living in the best country in the world at the best time in history. I recently once again read Warren Buffett's story about the lottery of life, and I think that we've won the Ovarian lottery by being born in Australia or having emigrated to Australia. We could be in a different part of the world where we don't even have these great options.
I really agree with you. I think despite the challenges ahead, I think we're in a great situation with so many tools and opportunities and our resources at our fingertips to solve some of these challenges ahead.
Well, I'm an optimist and I know that there are going to be challenges, but I also think Australians are going to be able to overcome those. Now, I love reading your regular articles, so I'm going to be leaving a link to your Substack in the show notes so people can learn from you as well. Lucinda, thank you very much for your time.
Michael, thanks so much for the chat today.
Boy, there was some interesting perspectives there from Lucinda Hartley. Now, if you have enjoyed this but haven't yet subscribed to this show, whichever podcast app you're listening to this on, or if you're listening on YouTube, please just stop for a sec and subscribe so twice a week you get the information from my regular guests. Now, I guess by now you recognise that I'm fascinated by demographics because I believe it will determine our future. And as a property investor, it's really going to be very important for you to understand that. Yet a lot of people currently are advising where to buy, how to buy, based looking at the rear vision mirror on data. There's all these new buyers agents and property gurus telling you, I've got all the data going back and I can tell you what's going to happen moving forward. Interestingly, that doesn't work that way. Now, we have all the data at Metropole Research going back for 15,000 odd suburbs way back back to the 1980s. But when we started looking at the future, rather than in the rear vision mirror, it changed the success of my own personal investing and that of my clients when we started doing this about 15, 20 years ago. So I know your inbox is inundated with offers to help you become financially free through property, webinars, masterclasses, property gurus, and a new band of buyer's agents. But a lot of these people don't have the perspective to understand what's going on or the deep research about demographics, because the property you're buying now should be the sort of property that's going to be in continuous strong demand in, 10, 15, 20 years' time when you retire, and then you're probably going to live for 30 years. And then many of you are going to want to pass this on to future generations. So it really is important to understand what sort of property is going to be in strong demand by owner-occupiers who push up the prices, but also by tenants in the future as well. So I know it's sometimes hard to know who to listen to when you're looking for advice. Sure, I'm biased. I'd like you to work with my team at Metropole, but we've got no properties for sale, and we've got on-the-ground teams in the largest property markets in Australia. And as I said, we've got all the research going back 45 years, but more importantly, the perspective to understand what it all means. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely outperform the markets and create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Just go to metropole.com.au and have an obligation-free, a complimentary wealth discovery chat with one of Metropole's wealth strategists to discuss your options.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In today's mindset message, I'd like to share the concept that successful people start before they feel ready. Now, let me tell you a story. In 1966, a dyslexic 16-year-old boy dropped out of school. With the help of a friend, he started a magazine for students and made money by selling ads to the local businesses. With only a little money to get started, he ran the operation out of the crypt inside his local church. 4 years later, he was looking for ways to grow his small magazine and started selling mail-order records to the students who bought his magazine. The records sold well enough that he built his first record store the next year. After 2 years of selling records, he decided to open his own record label, his own recording studio. He rented the recording studio out to local artists, including one named Mike Oldfield. In that small recording studio, Oldfield created his hit song Tubular Bells. Boy, does that bring back memories to me. I love that. And if you've been to any of my seminars, you know I play some Mike Oldfield music at the beginning of the seminars to create atmosphere. Anyway, Mike Oldfield became one of the record label's first releases. And that particular song, Tubular Bells, went on to sell over 5 million copies. Over the next decade, that young boy grew his record label by adding bands like the Sex Pistols, Culture Club and the Rolling Stones. Along the way, he continued starting companies, including an airline business, then trains, then mobile phones, and on and on. Now, almost 15 years later, there were over 400 companies under his direction, and today, that young boy who dropped out of school and kept starting things despite his inexperience, despite his lack of knowledge, today that young boy's a millionaire. And I guess by now you've recognised it, you've guessed it, his name's Richard Branson. Now, I recently read a story of how he started Virgin Airlines, and this tale seems to encapture his entire approach to business and life. Anyway, the Virgin went something like this. He said he was in his late 20s and he had a bit of a business, but nobody knew who he was at the time, and he was headed to the Virgin Islands because he had a pretty girl waiting there for him, so he was determined to get there on time. But at the airport, the final flight to the Virgin Islands had been cancelled because of maintenance or something. It was the last flight out for that night. So Richard Branson thought, this is ridiculous, and he went and chartered a private aeroplane to take himself to the Virgin Islands. But he didn't have any money to do so, so he picked up a small blackboard and wrote something like, Virgin Airlines, $29 on it, and went over to the group of people who'd just been on that flight that was cancelled, and he sold tickets for the rest of the seats on the plane and used their money to pay for the chartered plane, and they all went to the Virgin Islands that night. Now, amazing story, isn't it? Of course, Richard Branson's an extreme example, but we could all learn something from his approach. I guess one way of summarising the habits of successful people could be successful people start before they feel ready. If there was ever anyone who embodied this idea of starting before they felt ready, it really is obviously Richard Branson. The very name of his business group, Empire, Virgin, apparently he chose it because Branson and his partners started out as virgins when it came to business. Branson started so many businesses, so many ventures, charities, expeditions. It's simply not possible for him to have felt prepared, qualified already to start all of them. Couldn't have. In fact, it's unlikely that he was qualified or prepared to start any of them when you think about it. Apparently, he's never flown a plane, didn't know anything about engineering of planes, but he started an airline company anyway. He's a perfect example of that saying, the chosen ones choose themselves. So my message to you today, at the beginning of a new decade, a time when you've probably got some good plans for yourself, is if you're working on something important, you'll never feel fully ready. A side effect of doing challenging work is that you're pulled by the excitement and pushed by the confusion at the same time. You're bound to feel uncertain. You're bound to feel unprepared and unqualified. But let me reassure you of this. What you have right now is enough. You can plan, you can delay, you can revise all you want, but trust me, what you have right now is enough to start. It doesn't matter if you're trying to start a business, trying to lose weight, write a book, achieve any number of goals, get going with property investment. Who you are, what you have, and what you know right now is good enough to get started at least. Now, we all start in the same place. No money, no resources, no contacts, no experience. The difference is some people, the winners, choose to start anyway. No matter where you are in the world and regardless of what you're working on, it's the start of a new year. Well, we're a little bit into it. It's the start of a new decade. I hope you're going to start before you feel ready. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. Hey, but before you move on to the next podcast you're hoping to listen to, please let me remind you that I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher that we call Demographics Decoded, where we unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. This is a must-listen-to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, business, or entrepreneurship. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, please stop for a second and subscribe on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube. Now, if you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody else who'd benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Or just talk to them, tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour. You're definitely going to be doing me a favour in helping in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, you can catch up with me in between these shows on social media, or you can join my private Facebook group. Just go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I've got a special bonus for you to say thank you for subscribing. Just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There's a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. That's my way of saying thank you to you for taking the time to listen. Oh, by the way, if you haven't listened to the many podcast episodes we've already got, we're well into our 600s of episodes now. You can always listen to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?